Here we go. Facebook, YouTube, live streaming at the same time to both main pages. It is Dr. Zubin Damania. We are going to talk about the mutations that are generating variants of SARS-CoV-2 and what that means for the vaccine, what it means for hospitalizations, and what it means scientifically. We've talked a little bit about this before, but I really want to get into the weeds today because it's been all over the news. I guess there's another thing that happened in the news, which is inauguration of a new president. So there's that. Hi, Genevieve on YouTube. What's up, Cindy Storm on Facebook? All right, let's get into it. So we will talk about the inauguration another time because I think that'll have implications for health policy and the approach to the pandemic and all that. But I'm bored of it. Let's talk about mutant variants of SARS-CoV-2. And I did a show on this, but I really, like I said, I want to get into it now that people are showing up in the feed. All right. When we think about RNA viruses in particular, which this SARS-CoV-2 is, the virus that causes COVID, they are basically a little lipid envelope. This one in particular is a lipid envelope with some protein stuck on it. Inside it is the RNA. That lipid envelope contains the spike protein that allows the viral particle to sort of latch onto human cells through an ACE2 receptor. So human cells are also a lipid envelope holding a bunch of goo inside with a bunch of stuff, right? Remember the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the nucleus and the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, right? I'm taking you back to high school biology because it's fun and awesome. And my high school biology teacher was a pimp. So the human cells look a lot like the virus in terms of the overall structure, in the sense that there's this lipid envelope, a bunch of proteins, etc. So what's cool is, not cool for us, but cool scientifically, is that this virus is like almost like a little mini kind of, it's like a parasitic kind of mini cell. It copies some of the aspects of real cells, but it doesn't have all the machinery to do what it needs to do itself. It can't replicate itself. It can't do metabolism. Some have said, viruses just aren't even alive. They're not even a living thing because they don't have any of the metabolic processes that we associate with life forms. Now, again, I think everything's consciousness, so they're just a little fragment of consciousness, but that's another talk. All right, back to the virus. Since it's not itself alive, it needs a host in order to reproduce, which means that it's got to hijack cellular machinery to do its dirty work. And the way that SARS-CoV-2 does this is it comes into the body, and then on its surface, it has this spike protein, which is a glycoprotein. You don't really need to know that, but that's what it is for the nerds. And that glycoprotein happens to fit in a protein receptor on the surface of many human cells, including the respiratory epithelium, the sustentacular cells of the olfactory epithelium that I talked about the other day on the shows, maybe why we lose our sense of smell when SARS-CoV-2 infects us, and blood vessel lining. There's different places where ACE2 receptors are in the gut. So what ends up happening is this thing binds to these ACE2 receptors on the surface of the cells. And what it allows for is you've got the human cell and then you've got the virus. As it binds through its spike protein to the lock, which is our ACE2 receptor, there's a change in the shape of the ACE2 receptor protein and the spike protein where the virus just kind of bends down and merges with our cell membrane. And that's lipid to lipid, and they merge. And what it does, it's kind of like when you blow a bubble with one of the little bubble blowers when you're a kid or you're a dad trying to play with your kids, or you're just a weird adult that blows bubbles. We've all met them. They sit outside and they just blow bubbles, and you're like, you need to get a life and you need to act your age. You're a 70-year-old man. So when you blow a bubble, it's kind of like a cell membrane or the membrane around a virus. It's this little it's like because it's made of detergent, which is kind of like what cell membranes are because they have a little phospholipid component. They have a part that loves water and a part that loves fat. So kind of like a detergent. And so that kind of bubble, you've seen when another bubble sometimes can combine with the first bubble. And that's kind of what, and then just kind of like empty into it. That's kind of what happens with the virus when it binds through its ACE2 receptor and spike protein, and it merges with the cell and it dumps what was inside the bubble, which is its RNA, its own genetic code. That RNA then gets into the cell and it uses the same cellular machinery. Sorry, I'm just going to pull your YouTube comments, make sure it's working. It looks good. Looks good. What up, Carissa Davis? Talking to Justin. You guys are slapping each other down in the comments. That's what it happens when I go live to the whole world instead of just supporters. Supporters behave themselves. I'm not sure the whole world does. It hijacks the cell machinery, and what we would normally do, where in our nucleus, we take our DNA, we basically transcribe it into messenger RNA that leaves the nucleus, goes to the cytoplasm of the cell, finds a ribosome, which is a machine that basically translates that little bit of genetic code into a protein. And that's the punchline of the whole thing. You want to make proteins. And the way the virus does this is it does the same thing, but it, instead of coming from a nucleus and DNA, it has its own RNA. It merges with the cell. It spits the RNA into the cytoplasm of the cell. That RNA finds a ribosome, a human ribosome. The human ribosome doesn't know the difference. It's like, oh, RNA, my job is, I have one job, turn that into protein. So it does that. It assembles amino acids. It spits out a little filament of protein. That protein then folds, and it's assisted by various things. And then it goes through a process, because each part of the mRNA might code for a different protein that makes up the virus. It's then assembled throughout the cellular machinery. Remember, I was talking about Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum, and it ends up being turned into a little viral particle that then fuses back out with the bubble of the cell membrane and gets out. And that is happening billions of times when you're infected with a virus if there's nothing to stop it. So you need to know that, because by understanding how this virus works, first of all, the thing ain't even really alive. It has no intelligence of its own. And it's really a machine that hijacks a more complicated and beautiful machine, the human cells. And you can imagine over history how these things might have evolved. You have human cells, and then by accident, something happens where a little piece breaks off. It's got a little, piece of DNA or an RNA, and then that ends up hijacking other cells. And it doesn't start in humans, probably start in much lower creatures, right? And then pretty soon you have this parasitic thing that evolved, basically to live off of other cells. And sometimes it causes harm and sometimes it doesn't. But in humans, the harm seems to be caused by, there is some direct damage to cells because their own machinery becomes overwhelmed with copies of virus, and they can be destroyed in that way. But it's really our immune system that responds to the virus that can kill infected cells, damage in cells, cause inflammation, secrete these things called cytokines and inflammatory chemicals that cause fever and low blood pressure and a sepsis-like syndrome and fluid in the lungs and acute respiratory distress syndrome. And the next thing you know, you're dead of coronavirus. And that's kind of the mechanism, right? So now going back to this mutant variant thing. So when these viruses hijack cells in order to replicate, they don't have the same complex error correction machinery that human cells have. So human cells can start to transcribe DNA into mRNA, and there's error correction, and because you don't want a bunch of mistakes, otherwise you have malfunctioning proteins and you gum up the works and it's no good. Right? Especially when cells are replicating, if you end up making mistakes, you introduce mutations that can lead to non-functional cells or worse, cancer. And it's funny because in cancerous tumors, there's so little error correction that errors compound, and there's a lot of diversity of cells within a single tumor because all these errors kind of start to add up, and it just shows what happens when you don't properly control this process. Well, viruses are so simple, they don't have any error correction software. And the RNA viruses in particular are very unstable in that sense. So when billions of these things are replicating in human cells, a lot of them will have errors in the RNA transcript. So they won't be faithful copies of the original. Now, most of the errors might lead to, some will lead to nothing. Like there's really no major changes in the proteins that they encode for. Some of them make major changes through error that make the virus, it either doesn't assemble, like it's not coming together because of various changes, or it's now a useless virus. It can't replicate, it can't bind, it's got enough changes that it's no good anymore. So a lot of them are what they call deleterious to the virus. They don't do the virus any good. But every now and again, just randomly, a mutation will occur that will lend the virus some competitive advantage to its peers. Now, what do I mean by that? And this is really evolution 101 is what we're talking about. Looking at viral dynamics is actually studying the process of evolution in a vastly accelerated frame. So, if you look at evolution of like animals and stuff on the planet, it's super slow. We're talking about, millions, tens of thousands of millions of years before you see significant changes, the emergence of new species and that kind of thing. Viruses have a reproductive rate that is exponentially higher than, say, a mouse. So you can make billions of baby viruses in, hours, as opposed to, generations of mice, say. It would take forever for mice to evolve. Viruses can do it super rapidly, especially when they're allowed to replicate. In other words, out of control pandemic, without mitigation, without vaccines. Certain patients who have immune compromise where the virus can keep replicating in them and mutating. And so you have this big pool of potential variant virus that's suffered either one or more mutations. And the question is then, so what does that mean? Well, this is the evolution part. Evolution to occur, natural selection, has to have some pressure, some evolutionary selective pressure on the organism in order to give an advantage to certain organisms. So, in other words, if the world were without any challenges, in other words, we got all the energy we needed, all the food we needed, we had all the sex we needed, we reproduced anytime we wanted, everything was peachy keen, there was no drama, there would be no evolution. There would be no humans, because there would not have been any selective pressure or stress that would start to select for changed organisms that would have an advantage, that would then allow increasing complexity and ultimately the emergence of intelligence. So with viruses, the pressures are the following. What's going to select for a virus? Anything that gives it a reproductive advantage, that allows it to spread and reproduce. Notice what I didn't say. Allows it to kill us, allows it to make us really sick. That's not necessarily something the virus benefits from, because if it kills its host too fast, it doesn't get to spread. So when you think about selecting for variant mutations in SARS-CoV-2, it's really unlikely that you're going to select for a virus that kills its host faster. So what might be advantages for the virus? What mutations would give it an advantage? Well, it's able to bind more effectively to those ACE2 receptors. So any mutations in the spike protein that give it a advantage, in other words, it's more able to bind to those ACE2 receptors, or maybe it's more able to enter the cell easier once it does bind. Maybe it creates a immune response that keeps it asymptomatic for the most part, with the exception of a little cough, no fever, no major pains or aches that trigger people to worry about it. And that person then goes out coughing a little bit because that confers more spread of the virus. and spreads it more aggressively. Those things would be advantages for that virus to rapidly become dominant in a population where it's infecting. If you have a variant of that virus that's more lethal but less spreadable, it's going to start to disappear relative to its mutant peers that spread more easily and allow enough time in a host to spread before it kills them, or it doesn't kill them at all. There's not a big selective advantage to killing that host. So these kind of things now, and the other thing is like, if it gets an advantage where the mutation allows the virus to evade antibodies from the host. In other words, it's new. Suddenly it's like, oh, the host doesn't make antibodies to this anymore. And remember, antibodies are where our immune system recognizes components of the virus and mounts an antibody response through a complex mechanism I've talked about elsewhere, where we're now making proteins that neutralize, that bind to these key elements of the virus and knock it out of commission, and then can be taken up by other cells of the immune system. So a mutant that confers an advantage on the virus that says, oh, it's different enough now that these antibodies don't see it. So people who've been infected before and have now become immune are no longer immune to the variant. Or you've developed a vaccine, say, and the virus now has changed its spike protein so much that the vaccine-induced antibodies, because the vaccine is like a spike protein that you tell the body to make, those antibodies no longer fit to neutralize the virus. Well, that's a big advantage for the virus. Okay? So those are the theoreticals. Now, what happens in a population? So early on in the pandemic, pretty much everybody was mostly susceptible to being infected because this is a new coronavirus that humans haven't really seen for the most part, right? For the most part. We've talked about some exceptions to this. So if that's true, any old SARS-CoV-2 that comes out will probably do fine selectively. There's not a lot of evolutionary pressure on that virus. It can just go wherever it wants. And it already has huge advantages over the original SARS or MERS in that it can be spread before you have symptoms, or even in people that never develop symptoms. So it's very hard to stop because people who seem fine can give it to you. It seems quite contagious. Its respiratory number or reproductive number was like 2 to 2.5. That's pretty high. It means for every person infected, 2.5 people get infected. So that's exponential growth. In the early days of the pandemic, any SARS-CoV-2 might have done that. But what started happening is the evolutionary pressure starts turning up. As more people in a population get infected, become immune, they're now taken off the map. They're no longer targets for this virus, which means the virus has a harder time. The R0 starts to drop, and one person doesn't infect as many people. So now there's some pressure on the virus in this sense. You are going to start selecting for naturally occurring mutations in that viral population that spread more easily or evade antibody response. And that is how you start to see these variants emerge. They get selected for, they're able to reproduce more easily, and they now become the dominant variant. Now, this happened very early on in coronavirus. The version that became dominant around the world was not the original Wuhan version. It was a variant that maybe it was a little more contagious or sticky to ACE2 receptors, or maybe it's just that since SARS-CoV-2 tends to spread by super spreader events, just people that for unclear reasons, are hyper emitters, and it happens in a crowded space where there's poor ventilation and a bunch of people get infected just by sheer stochastic luck, just random chance. These variants become dominant because they get a chance to reproduce more through super spreader events. They're like the first movers. They're the ones first there and they're spreading. So the early variants may have been some of that, and then the pressure starts ratcheting up. More people get infected, more people become immune. In Manaus, Brazil, the thing ripped through that city. It's felt that about 2/3 of the population in Manaus were ultimately exposed or infected to SARS-CoV-2. By the way, they had quite a high, like 3x the mortality, the death rate of places that didn't have this widespread. So when you talk about like achieving herd immunity through natural infection, the theory is, well, you might be able to do that, but it comes at a very high cost, right? That's why vaccines are better than natural infection, because they don't come with the cost of killing a bunch of people from SARS-CoV-2. So back to Manaus. They felt, okay, now 2/3 of the population been infected. We're pretty sure that's a high pressure on that virus. Like the original virus is not going to find a host. You have community immunity. And what you see is what we saw, which is cases plummet, infection rate drops. But recently, infection rate has been going, cases have been going up again in Manaus. So what's going on? Well, we don't know yet, and I'm going to link to a Stat News article that talks about this in more detail. We don't know yet, but they found a variant in Brazil that may be more contagious, and it may also be a little more resistant to previously created antibodies that occur in natural infection. So there's a twofold thing here potentially. Maybe one is true, maybe the other is true, maybe neither, maybe both. But what may be happening is you've reached a herd immunity equilibrium with the original virus. Now you're putting selective pressure on that virus. Well, let's select for mutants that can get past this. Well, now you have a mutant that is maybe more sticky, more contagious, let's say. Well, now the herd immunity threshold goes up because this thing's R0 is higher. Each person can infect more people, which means even if you've reached a lot of infections and they're immune, you can now find hosts still because of the contagiousness of the virus. So now it takes 80%, say, or 90% of the population to be immune before you stop the spread of this virus. So that's one way that variants can cause trouble without making you more sick, right? How does that affect the mortality rate? Well, it affects the mortality rate because even though it's not more lethal in itself, you're infecting more people. And we know that the infection fatality rates, let's say 0.3, there are going to be more hospitalizations and more deaths just by sheer numbers of cases, right? It's not just a case-demic. You have the consequences of being infected, assuming, this is the same population. So that's one way that a variant can cause havoc, say in Manaus. Now, the other way is if it's less susceptible to previous immunity, well, then you're going to start seeing reinfections. And I think there's been one good, solid, scientifically verified case of a documented reinfection in the Manaus area. Now, we know that reinfection is relatively rare, right? Because we think that immunity is pretty robust initially. Now, the other reason you could see cases rising in Manaus is that Manaus was affected early on. Could it be that we're now reaching the threshold of time for natural infection to wane? That's possible too. So could be mutant variant, could be natural infections waning. So it's complicated, right? That's science. There's not a clear answer. You have to think this stuff out and look at all the possibilities and then measure and actually test. Now, the question of reinfection and duration of antibody response is an interesting one because we should make a point here. Reinfection, where it's been documented, is almost always, not always, but almost always associated with milder illness. So there's some residual effect that your body has a memory, immune memory, where subsequent infection isn't as heinous, right, in terms of sickness. And that's a positive thing. So I think that's good. Now, one thing I'll say too, and this ties into that, it's a bit of a tangent, but it's important. You can imagine the original coronaviruses that cause human colds, there's a few of them, when they first hit humans, when they first emerged from whatever animal host or wherever they were, caused a SARS-like syndrome. Because humans had no exposure to this before, and they had an overwhelming new cytokine immune response. And you can imagine, like, if Native Americans got a European cold, they probably died in droves. And what happens over time is as the virus comes to some equilibrium with its host, doesn't kill them too much, is still able to spread, and the host develops immunity over time, it becomes more like a common cold. You get the symptoms of some immune response, the muscle aches and stuff, and some, mucus and that sort of thing. But for most people, you brush it off in a few days. Almost assuredly, I think that's where COVID's going. So people talk about, oh, we're going to live with COVID forever. No, we're going to live with a cold, because that's what COVID will eventually become as it reaches equilibrium. And I think that's very encouraging, honestly. Now, the other things that are encouraging, let's talk about the variants. Back to the variants. I think, okay, and I want to say this. We've kind of gone through some of the science of this now. What's going on with the current variants? Are we all doomed? What's up with the vaccine? How do you evade the vaccine as a mutation variant? And what's the deal with that? All right, this is the deal with that. The vaccines, and I'm going to specifically focus on the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer BioNTech one, and the Moderna one, which I received the first dose of. They specifically code. They do this. They basically insert mRNA using a lipid envelope, and they kind of mimic how the virus does it. Enters the cell, gets transcribed, but it's a pure spike protein, just that spike protein. So the cells make the spike protein, show it to the immune system. Immune system makes this overwhelming antibody response to that spike protein. So all angles on that spike get antibody response. And as a result, we have a 95% efficacy in this vaccine because it's so good at nailing that spike protein and producing very pure antibody response without any evidence that we see of what we call antibody-dependent enhancement, which is where you have these kind of dirty antibodies that bind to other parts of virus that aren't neutralizing, don't knock the virus out, but can help it either form immune complexes that can be very damaging to humans or enter macrophages and other immune cells that can be damaging. So we don't see any of that with SARS-CoV-2 so far in the vaccine trials and the public that we've seen. I did a video on this the other day, so you should check that out. So back to this vaccine issue. How would a new variant be able to become resistant to a vaccine? Well, it would have to vary its spike protein enough that the multifocal antibodies to the spike protein that are produced by the vaccine can no longer bind to the spike protein. Now, that is entirely possible, but with other coronaviruses and with other viruses, it tends to take quite a bit of time. So you have to have a lot of mutations, right? Now, how can you start to select for a lot of mutations that'll do that? Well, have a mix of virus in the population in unvaccinated people and just a few vaccinated people and people who are partially vaccinated who don't get both doses so they don't have a robust immune response. Allow virus to kind of replicate that kind of evades it and select for that variant. And then pretty soon, over time, you're going to have what they call vaccine escape variants that are the vaccine's less effective or it's ineffective. That takes time. We don't see evidence for that yet with these current vaccines. These current vaccines are still highly effective. And even if they were ratcheted down in efficacy, they're still going to be hell of effective, bro. Like, I mean, really effective. So what that means is none of the variants we see so far, and they're being studied, and you got to study all of them. There's one in California that just emerged, and the question, everyone's like, is it resistant? Is it more contagious? We don't know anything about it. They're reporting this information, panicking the public, but they're not saying, well, we actually don't know. We really don't know if it's more contagious. It could have been a super spreader event and it became the dominant strain. Now, one of the things about these particular sets of variants is they seem to emerge independently in different locations, which means there's a common evolutionary selective pressure. So it must confer some advantage on the virus. So that's concerning. So you want to do genomic testing, which we haven't been doing consistently in the US. We're doing now. By the way, now that we're doing it all over the place, of course, we're going to catch all these variants that have been emerging. They've probably been around for quite some time. So bottom line is you'll see all the crazy headlines in the news. Don't panic, right? This is what viruses do. We expect this. SARS-CoV-2 is no exception. If you think about how it's going to evolve and evade vaccine and natural immunity, well, you got to allow it to replicate all over the place and just partially vaccinate people. So here's the punchline. And this is why I'm optimistic. if we can vaccinate a shit ton of people quickly, and that's what they're promising to do, we'll see if we can deliver on it, you will not allow enough viral replication to allow escape variants. You will put some pressure on that virus to mutate and so on. But the nice thing is, at that point, you've slowed the spread enough that it's not chaotically replicating everywhere and killing people and causing debility and spread. And if it does ultimately develop a escape, it's a relatively trivial thing for these mRNA vaccine developers to change the code and update the vaccine. We still don't know how long vaccine-induced immunity lasts, but people are thinking at least a year now. So even if you need a booster, and if that booster has to be tweaked, or maybe you need like what we do with flu, where it's quadrivalent, it's got 4 different serotypes of flu, we can do that. That's not the end of the world, right? But we get done with this pandemic. We push this virus to evolve in a direction that makes it more endemic and more cold-like, and which we know it's capable of because some people have mild to no symptoms. Some people just get a cough, right? Some headache. So that's why it's so important that we use the vaccine as aggressively as we can, because it looks like the thing works. But if we screw around, it's going to get out of the bag again. I think as the temperature warms up, I think as we get vaccinated, we're going to be able to take off our damn mask. And by the way, I'm going to have Vinay Prasad on the show to talk about this with me. It is the dumbest messaging ever to tell people, you know what? You're still going to have to wear your mask forever after the vaccine. Yeah, you want people not to get vaccinated? Tell them that crap. First of all, it's not true, because vaccination is going to lower your viral load. It's going to be, if you're around other people that have been vaccinated and you're still forced to wear masks, it's just dumb. It's just dumb messaging, and I don't think it's true. I think we should be able to take off our mask maybe a couple weeks after the second dose of the vaccine, if, enough people get vaccinated too, right? Now, again, could we then be infected by a variant? Yeah, sure. Nothing is a perfectly safe plan. We live with risk all day, every day. We go to work during flu season, even though there's a small chance flu could kill us or kill our children. We drive to work, which has a higher fatality rate by an order of magnitude for people under 24 than coronavirus does. And by the way, an elderly person is only twice as likely to die of coronavirus as they are from a car accident. Understand risk, understand where you fall on the spectrum, and stop living your life in fear. And stop messaging in a way that is going to generate a backlash, right? I think it's so important. We've done it so incorrectly. All right. Which brings me to the second half of the second part of this show. Now we have a new president that was inaugurated. I have to get this piece off my chest. It has nothing to do with a political statement one way or the other. No left, right nonsense. This is middle all the way. Integral thinking, I hope. Our national divisions, I think, can be laid squarely at the feet of powerful algorithms and monopolistic tech companies and monopolistic media companies whose business model, they're good people, whose business model is predicated on grabbing your attention and getting you to watch ads and click through. It's an attention economy. How do they do that? Polarization sells. Misinformation shares more easily. On social media, you can attack people as NPCs, non-playable characters. That's how they feel to you, even though there's a human being on the other side. Any post that generates outrage, that triggers your emotional elephant, triggers shares and engagement. We're addicted to these platforms. They're endless scroll wells of attention suck. And because their business model is rewarded for that, they're going to continue to do it while making motions of like deplatform Trump and moderate this and do that. Whereas, again, it's the fundamental business model that generated the misinformation machine, the QAnon conspiracy, the crazy crazy social divisions that we've seen, it's artificial. It's an artificial system that's hacking a natural human drive to tribalism, emotion, outrage, the worst angels of our nature. They're not angels, they're devils. And we're on it right now. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, right? So what I'm advocating for is we need a vast transformation in how social media is monetized. We can't continue this. And in the documentary, The Social Dilemma, they called it. They said, well, what's the outcome of all this polarization and mental health problems and all that? And they said, it's nothing less than civil war, which I don't know if you saw the Capitol riots, but that looked pretty close to me. You know, good, probably a few decent people in that gang that were radicalized by misinformation online, being in their own bubble. And then the opposite side, radicalized by their own information bubbles. So don't you think we as people deserve better? We as Americans deserve better than this? Like, don't you think we do? And yet here we are together on social media. So my pitch is this: a new business model for all this is, how about you can have some ads and stuff, but how about we actually form communities online where people share common interests and common goals? You pay to be in that community. And because you're paying, there's some skin in the game. And because there's some skin in the game, people are generally civil to each other. We teach critical thinking in our schools. We teach this idea that pure partisanism is a poison, that we're all trying to do the right thing on some level. And you take away this algorithmic manipulation that's been poisoning us. I mean, we've always been kind of divided as a people. That's fine. That's, e pluribus unum, from many one and from one many. That's the beauty of America. It's never been like this, where families are torn apart. Even in the Civil War, you have something specific. You have an issue that people are passionate about in real life, right? Here, just pick your poison of stupidity that people are going to argue over and weaponize it and radicalize you through social media. Twitter is the worst. And Instagram is somewhere where you're radicalized to FOMO and fakeness. And here I am in my duck face and beauty filter and look at my life. And then young girls are, more suicidal and more depressed than they've ever been. Our colleges are bubbles of thought policing and just knee-jerk, wokeness without thinking about what that really means. And I think it all can be laid on the step of the fact that we've been manipulated, not just by social media, but by media. It started with Fox News and CNN, each realizing, if we spin the headline with a political valence, we get more viewers because humans have that tribalism at their core, and it's going to generate outrage. I mean, remember Walter Cronkite? That guy couldn't piss you off. You just trusted him, man. It was a collective. We were all in this together. Biden today used the word unity quite a bit in his inauguration speech. I'm not sure I like that. I'm not criticizing Biden specifically. I'm saying I think unity sounds very kumbaya, and it's not realistic. I think what we need is just understanding of our diversity, that somebody who's conservative and somebody who's liberal can actually both be good people and come to mutual understandings where they overlap and influence each other in positive ways and transcend partisanism. And that's not necessarily unity. That's just humanity. That's just understanding that, hey, ultimately, on the consciousness level, we're all one. But we don't have to use platitudes like unity and all that. We can say, let's just be good to each other. Let's just understand. Love thy neighbor, right? And you can use the word unity. I just think, I was listening to the speech going, these are good words. Unity, we just need to be all middle, all of us, And this is just me thinking out loud because it's been, it's been a traumatic year or so for all of us, and I think to some degree we come together on these live shows and just kind of have it out. We look at other people's comments and it gives us some sense of community, and that's some beautiful piece of social media right there. And the idea that we can treat each other as humans behind these comments would be a beautiful thing. So, we're trying to do that in our group. We have Supporter Tribe on Facebook, YouTube, this thing Locals, which is kind of some people spin it as some like right-wing thing. It's kind of not. It's a place where any creator can create a community of like-minded people where they pay some fee to be in that community, and then they can post and they can share ideas and they can interact and they can get live shows and they can gift subscriptions and they can form a sense of community. And what I've noticed on Locals, there's, about 6,000 members there now, and some of them are paying and some of them are free members. It's absurd how kind and thoughtful people are to each other, even when they're posting stuff that would generate huge amounts of polarity on Facebook, because of our conditioning on Facebook to just be like, angry icon, you're a dumbass. There, the only people who are allowed to comment are paying subscribers. Everyone else can watch and can consume videos that aren't for subscribers only. But if you want to comment, you have some skin in the game, and there are other people who are paying there to be there too. So it's kind of like, hey, we're in this together. Yeah, man, that post, I disagree with that post, whatever it is you said about whatever. Here's what I think, and here's my angle on it. Hear me out. That's how they phrase their discussions. Like, what the heck? That's really great. Now, there's the danger that you form an echo chamber if everybody feels the same, and the creator encourages that. So it's kind of on communicators to be a little more alt-middle thinking, a little more free thinkers than towing a party line. That's what I think. Let's peep some comments since this is a live show. On Facebook, Christy Columbus says it's democratic. That's right. Every idea goes out there and is kind of is in the competition thing. And this is what happens on YouTube and Facebook. People put comments to try to gain social credit, to score points, not to display truth, not to have dialogue. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but that's the default. Feel it out. See what's happening, right? Misty Huffman says, I love your rationality in this chaos. Dude, this is the thing. I will claim to be rational, and much of the time I can pull it off, but there are times when I just lose my shit. And you'll see it here. You've seen it here. And you know what? I'm a little bit proud of myself because my knee-jerk tendency is to try to get angry about certain things like anti-vaxxers and things like that. And I've been a little better about that now because I actually understand the anti-vaccine sentiment, especially with the new vaccines. I understand it. It's like, dude, be skeptical. It's okay not to trust everything the government tells you because a lot of it's bullshit. It's okay not to trust big companies because they have a profit motive, which means if that profit motive disaligns from doing good in the world, then there's a problem. Now, the reason I like these new vaccines is, well, we've talked about the science of them. We've done lots of shows on them. But the profit motive of the vaccine company, the humanitarian motive of the scientists, and the motive of the regulators all align to try to do the right thing for people. And I think what's resulted is a public-private partnership that's been remarkable, that's gotten us really amazing results. And part of the reason this feels rushed, and I've talked about other reasons why people call it rushed and it's not, part of the reason it feels rushed is simply that we've been used to vaccine development that takes millennia because we're very risk averse with vaccines with good cause. You're giving them to healthy people, but also because we've thrown a lot of roadblocks and we've made it incredibly expensive, which means that pharmaceutical companies aren't going to pursue something unless they are really sure that the billions they have to invest are going to pay off. And that really screws up the alignment of incentives. So I think that's important to point out. Let's read some comments here. The golden rule, Mary Pat Hedges. Take a moment to figure out how another would like to be treated is the platinum rule. So going from golden rule to platinum rule, take a moment to figure out. It's just walking. I think Biden said it in his speech today, walking in another person's shoes just for a short period of time. That's a kind of compassion. So let's be hopeful. Whatever your politics are about Biden, and there's a lot of things I disagree with and I'm worried he's going to do. And there's a lot of things I'm like, oh, it's about time. And I have very mixed feelings about all politicians, right? But I think let's give him the benefit of the doubt coming out of the gate and hope for his success, like we did for Trump. And I did a show when Trump was elected saying, I'm really hoping this guy's successful, right? Because it's our country. It's our fellow humans here. It shouldn't be about knee-jerk stuff. And, I think the same goes with, this idea for vengeance and retribution and all that. Let's let stuff go and get on to the business of making the country awesome and helping people. YouTube side, Third Eye Jedi. We're over a year into this and we're still alive, right? All of us here have self-selected for being alive. That's a positive, right? Salam Abraham says, I am the fact checker. I am infallible. I think he's being ironic about YouTube's fact checker. So I have Facebook and YouTube's fact checker. So Facebook has basically almost shut down my Doc Vader account because it was affiliated with a group that was moderated by others where people were posting random stuff and their fact checkers were like, misinformation. They didn't realize it was all satire. And that site's almost shut down. Like I almost don't have a Doc Vader Facebook page anymore because the fact checkers. That's not right. So how do you parse this, We've given big tech too much power. That's the problem. Like you go to a smaller platform, you're not going to have a reach. That's the thing. That's why I'm still here. Believe me, I have wanted to leave Facebook a lot. YouTube I love because it's just high quality video and I have a soft spot. I mean, we're streaming in 4K right now on YouTube. That's crazy that you can even do that and you can see my nose hairs and in 4K. That's nuts. It's too much resolution, right? So I have a soft spot in my heart for YouTube, but Facebook, I'm not a user of Facebook. I find myself getting sucked into it when I do use it, seeing what friends and family are up to and getting outraged and upset and having FOMO and feeling my mental stress ratchet up. Then I go over to Locals and I skim through my feed and I'm like, damn, this is dope. This is social media the way it should have been, right? Why is it that this little startup is doing it better? Maybe when they get bigger, they'll screw it up too. Let's see. Let's see. Locals is the best, says Carissa Davis. Tara Fox, what is the other and where can we subscribe to chat? I'm sorry I missed it. It's locals.com. And by the way, if you subscribe on Locals and you decide to become a paying supporter, it's $5 a month. Do it through a web browser because otherwise Locals will charge you $7.99 to cover the Google and Apple Pay fees that come from using it on the app on the phone. So sign up on a browser on your computer, laptop, or tablet, and then install the app on your phone and you can follow along. And what I typically do for Locals is I'll go live to this page and I'll share the link on Locals and they'll get it live. And then I didn't do that this time because we're going public. And then I'll re-upload it in high resolution to Locals without any ads or anything, and they have it there. So there's no ads there. Ads are not part of the equation. It's really awesome. All right, so that's what I want to talk about today. And I we did this kind of free form and kind of off the rails, and that's how I like it. So deal with it. You'll see there's some shows we do that are super focused and tight, and this is not one of those. I hope you guys had a good time. I really am praying for our country's, just thriving in general. I want everybody to do well. And hopefully you guys are with me in this alt middle. You don't have to be a centrist to be in the alt middle. Watch the show I did today. I put out on Facebook with the captions about what the alt middle really is. All right. Love you guys so much. And